Hi, I'm Maggie. Thank you for stopping by Crafts the Charm today. You are most welcome here. In another video, I talked about how I like to make my backyard into a sort of tropical oasis in the summer, and in that video we made tropical pillows, and I will link to that video here. Today what I'd like to do is make some tropical wall art, and I think it might involve some casting techniques that we didn't do before. I did do a casting video before, and I will also link that here, but I want to try something a little bit different today, and then I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to go from there. I have some ideas, so I'm looking forward to making some sort of tropical wall decor. Let's go have some fun. We're going to start by casting some pieces, and I don't have anything that I want to copy. What I want is to make some leaves. So this is experimental. I thought that I would find some images on the internet, scale them to an appropriate size, and then cut them out of cardboard. Now originally I thought that I would use these wood planks from the Dollar Tree, so I scaled the images to about the size of the wood planks. And I really wanted a monstera leaf, and I wanted one that had some holes in it. And so I found this image, and this is, I think, the only paper image that I'm going to use for this project. Once I had the image cut out of paper, I just traced it with a pencil onto some kitchen cardboard. This is maybe a granola bar box. And then I cut it out of the cardboard. And once I had that ready, I mixed up some salt dough. It is 2 parts flour to 1 part water and 1 part salt. I don't mix oil into the dough because I'm going to be using oil on whatever I press into the dough to keep it from sticking, and I don't think the dough itself needs oil in it. We're not going to keep this, we're just going to use it for our casting. So once the salt dough was all mixed up, I put it inside a tin foil container, this little baking pan, and I sprayed some oil on it. Now that's cooking oil, but I've used baby oil in the past. So now I just pressed my cardboard into the salt dough. And this is a little tricky. I did use a toothpick a little bit. I wanted to press down all the pieces of the leaf and make sure that the salt dough came up wherever there was a space between pieces of the leaf, and then I used the toothpick to help me pull the cardboard out, and then I had to do a little bit of repair work on the bits of salt dough that were raised. Now the other cast that I thought I would make is of this sort of tiki face, and this cup is from the Dollar Tree, and on the bottom it is simply labeled cup, but this is a sort of cup that's available in the summer when they bring out their luau collection, I guess. And so again, I put oil on the part of the cup that I was going to press into the salt dough, and then I just sort of rolled the cup in my flattened out salt dough, and I tried to press fairly hard because I wanted to get a good impression. I didn't have another little tin baking pan, so I decided, you can see my table is sort of wobbly, I decided that I would just try to wobble the table and hopefully the plaster would settle that way. Once you have your molds set, you can mix up plaster of Paris according to directions and use cool water. Mix it very well, and then I just poured it into my molds and tried to get any air bubbles to settle, and then just waited, and I think I would check starting at an hour. It's pretty humid here right now, and so these didn't dry as quickly as plaster sometimes does dry. So I started at an hour and would just sort of tap them until I felt like they were solid enough for me to try to remove from the mold. And the good thing about the salt dough, of course, is that you can peel it away from the plaster. So you don't have to rely on the plaster being super solid before you remove it. So you can see that those came out pretty well. But one thing I realized was that I had forgotten to put any sort of veins on the monstera leaf. And I think just a sort of solid mass without any detail was not going to look very interesting. So what I decided to do, and this first monstera leaf, this is the worst one that I made. It's too thin. What I decided to do was to use the piece of cardboard this time as sort of the bottom of the mold. So I pressed the piece of cardboard in and then I left it. And I cut additional pieces of cardboard and glued them in for the veins. And then I thought I would try just hot glue by itself for detail. So to sort of build up around the mold and in the mold with details using the hot glue. And that worked pretty well. The hot glue in some cases did get stuck inside the plaster, but I was able to pick that out. So basically I just used my box cutting knife to trim the edges of the plaster, and any place where there was detail that I didn't think was deep enough, I could sort of trim that out with the box cutter. And then on the monstera leaf where I had forgotten to give it veins or any detail, I used the box cutter to cut a little bit or carve a little bit of detail into that leaf. Now again, that leaf was way too thin and it broke when I was trimming it. Now you can glue plaster together. I've used super glue and that works really well. But this thin monstera leaf, you'll see as I work with these pieces, it just kept falling apart. So that ended up being my practice leaf where I could try different things. So I made one more leaf with the cardboard and hot glue method, and this time I didn't bother trying to put cardboard in for the veins. I just used the hot glue. I really liked the way that worked. So I'd say if you're going to be making your own shape for casting, your own mold for casting, some combination of salt dough, cardboard, and hot glue could work really well. The only problem I'd say with the hot glue and the cardboard is that both can stick. And with the hot glue, again, I was able to pull that out with a combination of the knife and some really tiny needle nose pliers that I have. And the cardboard I more had to sort of scrape off where it had gotten stuck. Part of the reason that it may have gotten stuck, it got stuck to this second monstera leaf that I did, is because I did let this one sit overnight. So I really left it in the mold for too long. Now I really wanted some other interesting leaves, and I thought I would try a different way of doing the other leaves, because with the monstera it's got a nice shape, and I would think any leaf that has a relatively solid outside shape would be fairly easy to do, but I wanted to do something more like a palm, and that would be very difficult to make as a mold. So what I thought I would do this time was to take some fake leaves, some faux foliage, and this foliage, one comes from the Dollar Tree and the palm comes from a collection of leaves I got from Amazon. And this time I made more of a box. So I'm going to have a rectangle and I'm going to press the leaf into the plaster. So instead of pressing into the salt dough and pouring the plaster into the impression, I'm going to make a rectangle of plaster and then press the leaves in. And this time I'm using baby oil. to oil it. It really doesn't matter. I haven't found any difference with the oil. But with pressing the leaves into the plaster, what I found is that you really do need to work very quickly. The plaster starts to harden very quickly. So with the first leaf, I poured the plaster and then I took my bowl in to rinse it in the sink, and I came back to press the leaf in, and it was almost too late at that point. The second leaf, I pressed the leaf in immediately and I got a nice deep impression, but then it was a challenge to clean my bowl out. So I guess I would recommend keep some water where you're working, or do it in a bathroom or a place where you have a sink, and rinse your bowl, just fill it with water, do your casting, and then you can work on cleaning your bowl. Once I had all the pieces cast, I just cleaned them up with my needle nose pliers to pull out any hot glue that got stuck in there or other things, cardboard, whatever, and I used my knife to trim up any edges or any pieces, and it took a little bit of time, but not a lot. It wasn't difficult. Just want to take care with them and clean them up, and especially if you've made a thin one like my one thin monstera leaf, it just kept falling apart. You want to be very gentle. And by the way, I'm not wearing gloves because I'm working with the plaster. I think I had done some staining or something, and I just still had the gloves on. After I was done trimming with the knife and pulling glue out with the needle nose pliers, I then sanded all of the pieces. And here I was able to smooth out just some of the rougher edges, I guess, and I could give it a little bit of a curve by sanding the edges and just make it look smoother and more natural. After sanding, I wiped off all of the dust, and then I sealed them all with Mod Podge, and this is the non-glossy, the matte Mod Podge. And I am going to frame all of these, and I'm going to frame them in different ways. So I have this piece of old pallet wood, and I decided to sand this down and possibly use this as one of the frames for my pieces. And I love this piece just because it has those sort of different colors on it. I guess that's water damage. So I went out to the woodchuck porch to sand this, and last year I repaired, sanded, stained, painted this porch, but the woodchucks are still eating the wood on my porch again, so I've wrapped that beam in some plastic now, one of those cutting mats, in fact, from the Dollar Tree, and hopefully they will stop chewing on it. But aren't they cute? So this is where they live, the woodchuck porch. And today, unfortunately, I'm annoying them by sanding this little piece of wood on top of their house. Now, I really love the way they look white, these pieces, but I thought that they needed a little bit of contrast, so that monstera leaf that kept falling apart, that is my experimental leaf, and I have some of the burnt umber paint here, this nice brown, and some water and a paintbrush and some paper towel. And what I'm going to do is mix a tiny bit of water with this burnt umber paint and then brush it over that monstera leaf and then immediately wipe it off with the paper towel so that it will go into the crevices and it will cover the surface a little bit, but not a deep brown. So looking for just a sort of aged look that will bring out the detail. So I'm still on the fence about it. You know, looking at this on the video, I still love the way they look white. And you might prefer that look as well. But this is what I chose to do, and so I did do that sort of wash over all of them. I think it makes sense for the context of this craft, because if we're doing something tropical, it makes sense that if it were outdoors, it would be seeing a lot of weather. Even indoors, it might be seeing a lot of humidity. And so I think having an aged look like this makes sense, as opposed to if we were doing something more coastal or more desert where it would get a lot of sun, then maybe a more bleached look would make sense. Now, trying to decide for frames for this was really fun. So I have this old picture frame, first of all, and I have these slats which came from a window blind, and they're wood. They're a very thin wood, but you can see they came from a window blind. They've got the little holes where the string went through. And I've actually done this before, made something that looks sort of like a shutter by using an old picture frame and these slats. Now, if you don't have an old wooden blind lying around like I do, I would think you would be able to find some thin wooden trim that would work just fine, like a little bit of lath or something. I'm almost out of my wooden blind because, as I said, I have used it as a shutter in the past. So this wood is so thin that I can cut it with these shears that I have. So what I decided to do was to make it look like two shutters. So I was able to take advantage of that hole. And that will be covered by another piece that's vertical, so it doesn't matter that it's not super tidy on the end there. So I'm just going to cut the pieces for 2 blinds, and then I will glue them together with some wood glue. And I found it was easier to do this by tracing the picture frame onto a piece of cardboard and doing the gluing there, because the picture frame itself isn't flat, so it was going to be very difficult to glue things together and have them be flat using the picture frame. Now ultimately, once I have my frames, I'm going to want to attach my cast pieces. So how can I do that? Well, out comes the experimental piece again, and I have this block of wood. And so I thought we would try E6000. I really thought that E6000 should work. So we're going to put some E6000 on the back of the experimental piece, and then we will let that sit for 24 hours and see how it does. Down in my creepy basement, I have these 7-foot bamboo stakes that I bought at a place we have in New England here called Ocean State Job Lot. And you can see I bought them for $7. And that was a while ago. I looked this year and it didn't look like they had them, so I don't know how easy it is to grab pieces of bamboo like this. Now, I had bought them years ago for a different project, which maybe I will eventually do and do it for you. And then I had cut some pieces last year because when I made my monstera leaf table, which is out in my tropical area on my deck, I had originally thought that I would try to make legs for it out of the bamboo. So I have a few pieces already that are cut, and I just decided to use that length here. It seemed like a reasonable length. So I did cut the bamboo on my radial arm saw, and it can be very tricky to cut. It can splinter, but I didn't have any trouble, so I was lucky with cutting it. Now I think if you can't find bamboo, that you could probably use a thick dowel and paint it to look like bamboo. Now this bamboo has some sort of weird glossy finish on it, and you can see I have one piece there that is stained. So when I made the monstera table and cut the legs, I stained one of the pieces to see how it worked. And I successfully stained it, but I did not have success this time. I sanded these pieces, but what I think is that I probably didn't sand them enough, because when I applied the stain, it really didn't soak in. So I stained these, and I also stained a couple of these planks from the Dollar Tree. So they're a little bit longer and thinner than the square pieces I thought I would originally use. The planks stained just fine. I used this red oak stain. But what I ended up doing with the bamboo is I used some Savagram deglosser and removed the stain because it had gotten sticky. It was just sitting on the outside of them. And they were left with a little bit of color to them. I really wanted to match the color of the stained piece that I had from before. So I used some paint. I brought out again my burnt umber brown paint, and I dragged through that just a very little bit of black paint. And I think I got a pretty good match. You can see how the original stained piece is very uneven in the stain. So I tried to match that uneven look. And it's easier to match something that's uneven. So I think in the end that it's kind of hard to tell which one is stained versus which ones are painted, and it came out fine. Now with my shutter, what I wanted was a look of layers of peeling paint, because I'm imagining something that's just, it gets a lot of sun and humidity, and so you're constantly having to paint it and you end up with this thick peeling paint. So I thought I would start with a base coat of black, and originally I was going to do the entire quote-unquote shutter. If you think of the picture frame as the window and the slats as the shutter, what I ended up doing was just painting the slats and leaving the picture frame that black. So in retrospect, I think what I would have done is a crackle finish over the brown so that you could see the crackle through a little bit. But ultimately, what I ended up doing was I painted the whole thing black, let the black paint dry, and then I did a crackle finish, 2 layers over that on the shutter. And to get a crackle finish, it's quite easy. You just paint white glue, regular school glue, PVA glue, over the part that you want, where you want a crackle finish. So you paint your first layer of paint, then paint the PVA glue on, and then while that's wet, paint your second coat of paint on, and when it dries it will have a crackle finish, so you'll be able to see some of that first coat of paint through that. So I started with a bright green. My green paints were almost exactly the same, these green paints that I had. So I started with a bright green and painted that over with the crackle, and that came out quite well. And then I thought I would do a different green. So just with this sort of idea that, maybe you don't have a lot of options and now they don't have the same green at your paint store, so you have to use the different green. But I ended up using my favorite blue paint, which is the muted Aqua from Craft Smart. And so I did a crackle over the green with that. I don't think very much of the original black shows through those 2 colored layers, but I really loved the way it came out with the green underneath the blue. And then because I had that black on the outside part, the window part, I decided to do another coat of black but do a crackle finish over it to give that outside a little bit of the same texture. I probably should have done a brown and then a black over that, or again done a crackle originally, but I was just sort of making it up as I went along, and originally I didn't even think that I was going to leave the black on the outside. So if you were doing something like this and you had a wood tone, you might want to do the crackle over the wood tone and let a little bit of that wood come through. Now with the bamboo, once painted, my challenge was to get them to adhere, and I tried hot glue, and maybe because of the paint it just didn't stick at all. And I tried wood glue, and that didn't work so well either. I mean, it held a little bit better than the hot glue. So my intention is to lash all of these horizontal pieces of bamboo to the 2 vertical pieces of bamboo. But I wanted to glue them down first because lashing them without having them stuck to each other was going to be very difficult. So I also tried just tying them on just with a quick knot to lash over. Ultimately, the wood glue held the best, and it was tricky, but it held well enough that I was able to lash those pieces on. Now, the lashing instructions I got from Boy Scouts of America website, and I have lashed before in the pillow video, believe it or not, and I'll link that here. But I just followed the instructions and I used this jute twine. Now, I needed quite a lot to lash, 48 inches that I used to lash these pieces together, and that's because the bamboo is so thick. Now, I bought this luau skirt at the Dollar Tree. I bought the adult size. I thought that I wanted something that looked a little bit like thatch, like a thatch roof. And I thought this luau skirt would do the trick. So I have the picture that was originally in that picture frame, and it's on this sort of pegboard material. I'm not sure what you call that. I felt a little guilty about gluing anything to the picture, so what I did was I covered the picture itself in an old shopping bag so that I would glue to the, actually I didn't glue at all, so that I would fasten things to the back side and not do anything with that picture. The reason is I'm not sure where it came from. I think it may have been hanging in my grandparents' kitchen and it just felt disrespectful to glue to it. It's possible I bought it at a thrift store, I just can't remember. So what I decided to do with the luau skirt was I got it as dense as I could. So it threaded along this bit of jute. So I just sort of squished it all together to get it as tight as I could. And then I used the brown nautical rope from the Dollar Tree, and that comes in 2 different sizes. So I wrapped the thinner size around the middle, and then I framed that with some wider of the nautical rope. And in order to hold that into place, as I said, I didn't really want to glue, so I wrapped it all the way around, and then I just sort of wove some jute through it on either end and tied it, and that held it in place very well. And as far as the ends of the nautical rope, I wanted to keep that visible, so I whipped the ends of the nautical rope. And I've done that technique many times. The first time I did it was in a candle video, which I can link here. But basically, you're going to give yourself a length of the rope and make a small loop at one end. Hold the loop against whatever you're whipping. Now, if you're whipping the end of a rope, like I'm doing here, you want to wrap in the opposite direction of the way the rope is wrapped. So you just wrap over your loop, and then you pull the end of your string through the loop, then pull the other end to pull the loop under all of those wrappings that you did, and then pull the whole thing tight. And then the final frame is these 2 pieces, these little planks from the Dollar Tree that I stained. And I just picked the sides that I liked the best, and I thought I would staple them together. I didn't have any staples that were shallow enough to staple this without them coming through. So I ended up taking some popsicle sticks, and of course I used wood glue to hold it all together, but wood glue and staples. I glued the popsicle sticks down the middle there and then stapled so that the staples would go through the popsicle sticks and then into the wood along that center seam. And then I put some popsicle sticks at the top because all of these pieces will need to hang, and what I use to hang them all is the 22 gauge florist's wire that I like. I just stapled that to the back of all of these pieces. The only one that I didn't do that with was the picture frame, because that already had hanging wire on the back of it. So with our experimental monstera leaf stuck to the old piece of wood, the monstera leaf continues to fall apart, but the glue seems to have worked quite well. So I'm going to trust the E6000. I'm also going to use hot glue. I sort of laid the frames out on my rug in a way that I thought looked decent, because this is going to be on a wall. And then I tried to pick the best cast pieces to go on the different frames. So that's what I'm doing here, is just sort of trying to figure what would I put where. And with that figured out, I then used the E6000 to adhere those pieces to their frames. I also used hot glue. I put the hot glue sort of around the E6000. So with these cast pieces, their backs aren't particularly flat. So I put the E6000 where it's raised, and I put the hot glue basically where it's not raised, but because I can put a lot of hot glue, I sort of built it up with the hot glue. And I do this just so the hot glue can hold it in place while the E6000 is curing, because E6000 takes 24 hours to cure. The only one I was sort of worried about was the grass skirt, because I was adhering to the nautical rope. But it does seem to have worked. It hasn't fallen off yet. And here's what they look like as a collection. So I have this fence where I can sort of hook things over the top of it to hang them temporarily. So that's what I did, and that way I can just change the length of the jute that I'm hanging it with in order to get a different configuration. Like, I think my little guy with the grass skirt might be a little too low here and a little too far to the left. But that's the general idea of how it looks together.
So what did you think of our tropical wall decor? I had so much fun with this project. The most fun part was trying to think up different ways to frame all of the different cast pieces. And I wonder if you have a favorite frame, and if you do, please tell me in the comments. Or if you have ideas for frames that I didn't try, or variations on the frames, I'd love to know about them. I hope that you found some inspiration here. One thing that I think is great about all the different frames is that you don't have to do an eclectic collection like I did. You could pick one frame style and just vary that, or even just keep it the same. Once I made the shutter, I actually thought of abandoning all the other ideas and just making a set of shutters in different bright colors. I thought that would be really fun. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you like this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.